Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, what archaeology can teach us. We dedicate this program to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark from La Sierra University. I direct the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology, and my normal co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, is still on assignment. Dr. Kent Bramlett, who teaches mostly archaeology, but languages as well, and history, ancient history.
A little bit.
Associate Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra. We have been working our way. Maybe that isn't the right word to use, because this has been fun. If work is fun, then okay, then we're working our way.
It has been a lot of enjoyment in the process.
It really has, because we've looked at all this biblical literature, and we work with the Old Testament all the time, but now we've forced ourselves to kind of put on this new set of lenses that forces us to think about archaeology.
Each book, systematically.
With every single book. And we have made it through several. We are now in the prophets, and we are doing these chronologically, not just the canonical order, but we're doing it chronologically. So we're dealing with the 8th century prophets. We've talked about Amos, and we are talking this episode about Hosea. Amos and Hosea, are they books that you're drawn to in the Old Testament? Do they signal sort of the same thing? Are these two prophets sort of on the same page, or are they talking about different things?
Well, it's interesting. They're both dealing with major themes. I mean, Hosea, what more classic a theme could you have than the unfaithfulness of Israel, in that it's following after the Canaanite gods. This was a problem that was recurrent up through, well, to the exile.
To the exile.
And so we hear themes of this through many of the prophets, but, well, and the kings are judged by it in the histories.
Right.
But Hosea has a sort of just grab your attention way of presenting this. I think more than any of the other prophets, this whole sort of familial relationship, this breaking down and the agonies involved, projecting then how God feels about this process. And I wouldn't say it's cheerful reading, but it certainly is powerful.
And it captures one of the two major points of emphasis of the prophets, kind of how we relate to God, to deity.
If you go to Jesus,
right.
Reading Deuteronomy, it's
exactly
our relationship with God.
That's right. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart. Then we go to, well, we've been to Amos, but we'll be coming back to people like Micah and Isaiah. Isaiah actually combines them in a unique way, I think. But with Amos, it's more how you treat your fellow
Love your neighbor
being.
as yourself.
Right. You talked about the sort of the gripping nature of Hosea's story. This family, and we know the names of all of the kids. We know the name of the wife. Hosea not only talks through this family issue, which is wrenching. It is absolutely wrenching, as any divorce situation would be, or breakup of a family. But he does so as, I think, biblically speaking, among the biblical writers, the master of metaphors. He hatches analogies all over the place. And per chapter, there's nobody in the biblical literature that matches him. All of these metaphors. And we'll be looking at them because they become a source for references to different sorts of things that we as archaeologists can actually explore and find some things to connect with. So here's a metaphor. Here's something that happens to their family. And Hosea turns that into something that happens between Israel and God. And then the rest of the book, all of these metaphors. We'll think about that more when we look at the outline. So, a moving book. This was a book that kind of catches you at the heart level.
It does, yeah.
Before we actually do that and kind of get into it, what do we have in front of us here with artifacts? We want to try to have artifacts that relate to the book, and so we'll make some connections. What do we have?
Well, since Hosea deals so much with the gods of the Canaanites and the worship of those gods, we do have artifacts which illustrate Canaanites' cultic activity or worship activities. These sorts of vessels are found in Canaanite high places or temples, the chalice, the goblet, probably for burning incense here. And little images or statues here, that figurines that we think probably had a religious nature to them. There have been other proposals, but none as convincing as the idea that these related to worship.
Some have recommended that they do represent a deity, Asherah, for instance. Others have suggested they may, while perhaps connected with a female deity, are more like good luck charms, or maybe even votives that you would give in a worship setting. Where do you come down on that? I'm putting you on the spot, but I mean the argument, the debate really is fairly significant. So
it is. I wish I knew more about their context. We find them in so many locations. I know that in the temple that we excavated in Jordan, from Canaanite times, 1300 BC, that the clay figurines were left in this temple in the votive position in front of the representation, really the standing stones that represented the deity. So it would seem that they're not exactly the deity, but they're somehow these prayers left behind, much like candles in some churches.
Well, in that temple, don't we have the deities at least represented in the standing stones?
Exactly. We already have the deities, and they're placed in front of them.
Why would you do
Why would you
that?
reduplicate?
Exactly.
So perhaps representing the wish of the supplicant that their prayers would stand before the deities for a longer period. It's just really hard. I guess I come down a little bit on that side.
Well, that may actually be helpful for the archaeological fact that there are hundreds of these found in Jerusalem, the shadow of the temple.
Were the largest concentration.
Absolutely, close in the capital city of Judah. So why would that be the case if in fact there was so much there's so much prophetic and legal material against the idols? Did they think of them as idols, or did they think of them as this kind of supplement? This kind of,
and again, pilgrimage people coming, that would tend to concentrate them in the city where people worshipped.
We're actually dealing with a major area of archaeological study when it comes to texts and artifacts, and that is hermeneutics, the very principles of interpreting. And how is it that we can come up with several different interpretations for something that is so ubiquitous, it's everywhere, certainly in the 8th century, 8th and 7th centuries. So we do have this. Okay, what else do we have here?
Well, we go down to, again, more of, well, this is a very nice bowl. Again, bowls that were in temples, we know that they're often metal, but we don't find them very often because, well, as the Babylonians did, you would take them, reuse them, or melt them down. Notice the bowl heads. Again, symbolic probably of the deity whose companion was the bull. We know that Baal's companion animal was, or Els, we know from Ugaritic literature as well. And, of course, the incense pan here, used for bringing coals into the temple. Okay,
so mostly religious, or as we would talk about them, cultic. That's not kind of the popular use of the term cultic, but more scientific. And then from here over, more domestic until we get to this text, we will be looking at several texts from antiquity that are going to provide some background for Hosea. But here, something more domestic. What do we have?
Well, grinding. Again, preparation of wheat to flour to make bread. It's one of those metaphors that you mentioned that Hosea is rich with, of preparation and baking of bread. So this essentially is the whole process. We don't have the lower grinding stone here, but the wheat would be placed on the lower grinding stone, and the upper grinding stone then would grind it into the flour.
All right. Now what about the vessel here?
Well, this is a fine vessel of Phoenician style. And the Phoenicians liked these very nice finishes. So this would have been a rather elite, that is, someone who had some money would have owned a vessel like this. But it would go in very nicely with a range of artifacts that we find here.
Now, Hosea doesn't deal so much with these class distinctions. Amos does because of his concern for social justice. Hosea, that's not his primary concern. His primary concern is what's over here and worshiping appropriately.
Yeah.
So, well, let's then take a look at the book and its outline. Let me say a word about this outline. Two parts. But when we come to the second part, and the first part is actually kind of Homer and Gomer and Hosea. So there you have the actual people and their family, but that is metaphorical for God and Israel. So you have both, the literal and the metaphorical. When you get to the second part, the divine words to Israel, this is 11 chapters here, the bulk of the book. It is not organized at all. In fact, one a scholar from some time ago suggested that these chapters, 4 through 14, are characterized by the artless rhythm of sighs and sobs, which suggests that what happened in chapters 1 through 3 really happened. Some people would say the whole thing is metaphorical. Hosea is a master of metaphors, but most people would say that what happened at the beginning really did happen, and then he made good use of it.
Yeah.
So, and if that's true, you have this back and forth. I mean, you have a statement that God will love you no more. And then a couple chapters later, God loves you forever. So this artless rhythm of sighs and sobs may actually be a good way to think about it, because this is something that has captured this prophet at the heart. And it's this prophet more than any other, well, okay, Jeremiah perhaps, who talks about heart, and who talks about intimacy, who talks about the notions of human closeness and care and knowing, kind of the biblical knowing that results in kids. This is Hosea. Jeremiah does the same thing, but this is Hosea. So this is different from these straightforward woe oracles and speeches that Amos makes. This is really an invitation to think about and to love God. Truly is. So let's move on then to some of the basic issues. We won't have time to talk about the general history as much as you are a historian.
Well, it is an interesting time period.
Yeah. And the Assyrians? Assyrians come about when?
Well, they had been resurgent earlier, but it is in the later part of the 8th century when they're an immediate threat once again. There had been 40 or 50 years when Israel and Judah both prospered, and it had been during a sort of a hiatus of Assyrian expansion, but now they're on the horizon again.
So when the empires are around, the growth and the potential seems to be curtailed a bit.
Yeah.
And we see that in the archaeological record too, in terms of the prosperity, what we can see of prosperity. So, and prostitution, this is a major part of the first chapters.
Right, and it wasn't so much a question of if, but who.
Right.
And like priests' daughters were not supposed to be prostitutes, but again, it was a class issue.
And it was tied to, not just to the normal life of people in an agrarian society, but to religious activities and rituals as well. So this is sacred prostitution.
Right. There's a lot of debate about how that transpired, because a lot of the stories come from the Greeks and enemies, but there seems to be a sort of a coming around to a consensus now that indeed there was some sort of prostitution associated with worship, and temples.
We'll also think about some family dimensions, relationships. We have it so well expressed in the story of Hosea. And religion and worship in the 8th century. So some artifacts, we have seen some of these. We will see some photos of visual representations of some of the deities and some of the worship paraphernalia, evidence, archaeological evidence for the Canaanite deities, and we'll look at some of the agricultural things. I mean, the metaphors that Hosea used go all the way across the board. Agricultural and the animal kingdom, humans, and so on. And so we'll see the metaphors as noted here. Cooking, and cooking with ovens seems to stand out. Israel is like a heated oven in its lust, chasing after these, if we think about worship as an immoral activity, and the sexual encounters and sacred prostitution, it's like a heated oven. Sometimes it's a heated oven describing another characteristic of Israel, but oven seems to show up several times in several verses. And lots of animals, including lions, mother bear. God is pictured as a mother bear, robbed of her cubs. And that's how you make God angry. If you make God that angry with your prostitution, your religious prostitution. This is a mother bear who's protecting her cubs. So
It's vivid.
It was extremely vivid. All kinds of things from everyday life. Okay, what we want to do is explore Canaanite religion. This is the context in which Hosea makes his plea for people to leave it alone. So what do we have?
Well, El is the high god of the Canaanite pantheon. El is related to Elohim. Essentially, it becomes a generic word for God, picked up by Israelites. So it is Hebrew, it is Canaanite.
And both of them show up in the Old Testament.
They do.
And both of them applied to God.
Yahweh, to God.
And sometimes Elohim to the gods,
Where,
rather plural.
Where the
because
context
name
is, right, implicates that. El in graphic art is always shown seated. From Ugaritic texts, we think of El as sort of old. Some people would use the word otios, sort of going out of everyday function, for the more exciting younger gods like Baal, the storm god. Which,
speaking of,
yep, always shown standing, striding, one foot in front of the other, and smiting. So originally the upstretched hand would have held a mace, and probably representing thunder, and then the lower hand would hold the arrows or the bolts of lightning. So both of those components of the storms.
So El seated on the top of Mount Zaphon, the mountain of the north.
That's right.
But Baal busy doing things.
Very active. The one you really want to look out for you, to bring the rains for your agricultural seasons.
Survival.
Survival.
That's right. And we'll see some of that imagery in texts about Baal. Okay, some of the goddesses. Who are these?
Well, Asherah and Ashtarte. Asherah is a very important deity in Canaanite worship. I would argue that she's probably the most common. Again, we sometimes have problems with the iconography identifying clearly. The one on the right is often, that plaque form has often been identified as Ashtarte. Sometimes the identities blend, and probably 3 different times and places, different prominence is given.
Could we bring Anat into this picture? How does she figure? Because she's certainly mentioned and part of this, part of these deities.
Right. We have fewer names that identify Anat in the compound theophoric component of a human name. But Anat is the sister of Baal, a very formidable goddess, probably not as frequently represented for whatever reason.
Now, let's keep Asherah in mind because we're going to turn attention to a stand, a place of worship that suggests, that most people suggest is Asherah. We also need to think that in Elephantine, the island in the Nile River, in the upper, that is the southern part of the river, a temple built by Jews, 5th century maybe, and they worshipped Yahweh and his Anat. So we need to be thinking about these things. Hosea rises to say something when he hears these things, I detect.
Yep, it's very relevant. I mean, this was a very popular understanding of God.
What about with the bull? Is that a very popular understanding?
It was, yeah, certainly. In Ugarit, El is the signifier, the companion animal of El, and probably doesn't represent El exactly, but would be perhaps the throne base, the platform, and the strength would be symbolic of El's
now, this
action.
Particular one,
it's a high place.
It's a high place. It's an Israelite house.
Well, it dates from that time, doesn't it?
Yes. So on the top of,
near
Mount Ebal.
one of the open air sanctuaries.
Right. Okay, some of these, like we have on the table, these pillar figurines, again associated with what? A deity, or maybe good luck, or maybe votive, my gift to the deity.
Right.
Maybe all of those. Maybe there were times when they served all of those. Okay, the Tanakh cult stand.
Right, and the alternating levels here. The top and the second to the bottom probably represent aspects of Yahweh, or God. Notice the empty space on the second level, one up from the bottom, between the cherubim. right? And we think of the Ark of the Covenant with the mercy seat between the cherubim.
And animals, part of the, at least the ancient world's thinking about cherubim.
Symbols of, yeah.
Right.
And the horse, perhaps, mentioned in the time of Hezekiah at the top.
And then if you go to the lower register, of course, then you have the female deity. Most people would identify that with Asherah.
Right, and the third one, so alternating.
And the third one, because of the, it's a kind of a tree of life, motif with the animals, yes, eating. So at least at Tanakh, and I had always thought this was a bit earlier. This slide is dating it to the 10th century. I thought a bit earlier. But in any case, this is an Israelite place. It's in the hill country. And at least some people are worshiping this pair, this couple. Okay, family. Egyptian, not necessarily from our time period, but an illustration of a family. For Hosea's family, we actually need one more child, but here, dressed in Egyptian style. Now, if we move to the Israelite, this is about 7th, 8th century BC, at an Israelite house in the Harvard Semitic Museum. And you can see the different sorts of vessels, and if you look carefully at the right side of that picture, it's actually a manger separating whatever activities happened here from where the animals were stabled. So we're talking about living fairly close to animals. What do you think?
Another model showing the baking of bread.
Now, you've suggested before that these models, at least many of them, seem to come from Egypt, illustrating daily life. You see lots of tomb paintings with life activities depicted, but the models as well.
The models were, well, to provide servants in the afterlife so that the individuals themselves wouldn't have to labor.
That's right. And bread isn't going to be there readily, so you have to have someone there to
it's so convenient for us to understand and to see three-dimensional models of everyday life. So here the person is getting ready to put some loaves into the oven.
This is probably from a later time. But what we want to do now is look at somebody's attempt at experimental archaeology with a tabboon. Now, there are a couple of bread baking types of ovens. But you can see on this one, the bread is, what, slapped up against the
and it
side?
sticks there and bakes. And it's like a reflector oven. It captures the heat from the coals.
Now, some of them have stones on the base. And when you put the bread down, they kind of get the image of the stones. And when you pick it up, you've still got the rounded stones. But they've been heated with a fire. Now, archaeologically, that model that we just saw comes from a tabboon like this, an oven like this. And then another one here being excavated as we're looking at the picture. So archaeological evidence. Again, these ovens show up several times.
Yeah, we've found several, well, archaeologically as well. Many houses have.
But we have found some at our site too. Important part. Shifting from the kitchen to the world of nature. Doves, one of the metaphors. Israel is a silly dove. I'm not sure I like that way to put it. I love doves. They're such a great, graceful symbol of peace and graciousness. But this dove is flying, it's silly because it's flying off to Egypt one time, turns around, flies off to Assyria for support on another. So it's a silly dove. Wild donkeys is one of the metaphors. These are domesticated donkeys. But we see lots of images of donkeys.
We do, right.
And we see lots of donkeys.
They lend themselves to many metaphors.
They do. And some of them good.
Some positive, some not so much.
Some of them not so much. Okay, what does this depict?
Again, behavior, the predatory instincts of the lion.
So the metaphor of a lion comes alive with a contemporary image.
It is, yeah.
Artistic craftsmanship from nearby. This has to be from a bit later. I don't know when wooden combs began, but in any case, a lion on a wooden comb. Incidentally, I understand that the combs at Qumran had lots of lice eggs attached. So people were scratching their heads, I think,
Probably one of the functions of the combs.
Yeah, perhaps so. So here, the Ishtar Gate, beautiful representation of lions. And then this seal.
Right, also from the 8th century.
Also from the 8th
Second.
century. Jeroboam II, we're talking about a contemporary king here. And found at Megiddo,
Right.
again with a lion. So when Hosea picks up with the metaphor of a lion, people are acquainted with them. Maybe not as much the wild animals. They would have lions. What kind of lions would they have?
The Asiatic lion was endemic in the area.
Typically smaller than the African?
Right. But it ranged clear across into Western Asia, which is the Middle East.
Right, so we do have them.
The Romans hunted them extensively.
Okay.
I think are responsible for their extermination in that region.
So Hosea takes what people were acquainted with.
Yeah.
Takes
Bears,
some kind
lions.
of symbolic meaning, carries some kind of symbolic meaning with that, sometimes twisting it into a new direction and doing so creatively. It's very literarily crafty. Okay, this is another one of those ivories.
Yeah, the composites, the cherub. Again, lion feet, human heads, wings.
Right. Ezekiel talks a lot about these. We'll have time to look at those then. Then we have some inscriptions too. Stories of Akkad, which is Eastern Mediterranean, which is what, Lebanon, Syria, that kind of location, and Keret and Baal and Anat. So we'll read a few of these. What do we have?
On the 7th day, Baal stood up before El. The divine patron of Ugarit addressed the divine assembly. The once powerful Daniel is now powerless. He is shamed for lack of a son. Surely he should have a son like his brothers. He needs an heir like his covenant partners. He has blessed the divine assembly with food. He has filled their sanctuaries with drink.
Supplying what they need for their banquets and so on. Daniel, we may come back to, well, we will when we get to the book of Ezekiel. Anat promised Akkad, ask for silver and I'll give it to you. Ask for gold and it will be yours. Just give the divine patron of love and war your bow. Let the virgin, that is this goddess, have your arrows. This is part of this world of Canaanite religion that Hosea comes out against. Okay, what do we have here?
Anat continued, ask for life without end and I will give it to you. Ask for immortality and I will grant it to you. Your years will be as countless as the years of Baal, your months like the son of El. Baal will bestow on you immortality. He will feast you at his table forever. Baal will give you the bread of life. He will serve you the wine of everlasting life. Storytellers will sing of you forever.
Some of this language sounds like the Psalms, and we have the same kind of thing going on. One more, finishes this one, Ken.
The Daniel officially declared that the land was cursed. The powerful announced that a prolonged drought had begun. For 7 years, Baal will disappear. For 8 years, the rider of the clouds will dispatch no dew and no rain. Rivers and springs will dry up. There will be not a single thunder shower.
Does that sound something like Elijah?
It does, doesn't it?
And Baal or Baal. So these connections provide the kind of context that I think give us extra meaning and kind of a value added to our reading of Hosea. Great book. Thank you, Ken. And thank all of you for joining us. We look forward to next time. And until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.